I hardly know what to say. First, I want to thank Lynn for, when she told me she was going to do this conference, I should have known it would be as good as it's turned out to be, but I'm very grateful to her, to Evelyn for their friendship, to me, and as you heard, to our family, to the Lord Mayor for making us feel welcome. They're not here anymore, but I thought Christine Lagarde and Prince Charles were both very good this morning, and I was grateful for their participation. There are two former African presidents here who were my comrades in arms, former President Obasanjo of Nigeria and John Kufuor of Ghana, and my friend, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd of Australia. I thank them for coming. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I sat through as much of this as I could, given some other things I had to do today, and I've learned a lot, and I never learn anything when I'm talking. And when I learn something when I'm talking, I know I have screwed up. You know, I made a terrible mistake. But I thank you for giving me a few moments. I want to begin with the end of what I'd like to say. There are some things we know and some things we don't. And I have listened to all of these things. We all believe that capitalism is wonderful to create markets, jobs, businesses, wealth, opportunity, prosperity, and that it has some serious challenges and needs to be more inclusive. We believe, I think we all believe, that intelligence, effort, and aspiration are more or less evenly distributed across the globe, but opportunity, investments, and systems that give predictable good results for good behavior are not evenly distributed. We came here to talk about what can be done and who's supposed to do it. What should the private sector do? What should government do? And increasingly, what should non-governmental organizations like our foundation and others do? So I'll start at the end. This is the most interesting age to me in history. It's certainly the most interdependent. We're in England, so I have to note this is the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. It means when something bad happens, like all this conflict in Ukraine, and we think it won't amount to a hill of beans, we have to be humble in the face of uncertainty and instability. But most people forget today, because we all want to think the times we live in are totally unique, the wealthy countries of the world were actually more trade dependent in 1914 than they are today as a percentage of GDP. The reason this age is more interdependent than it was then is mostly because of information technology and travel and immigration and what we know about each other and what's going on. I mean, I've been really upset today about that poor woman in Sudan. He's been told if she doesn't renounce her Christian faith, she's going to be executed because it's against the law to abandon the Muslim faith. She had a Muslim father, a Christian mother. She was raised as a Christian. She married a Christian. She's in prison 8.5 months pregnant with her 1-year-old child, sentenced to die. How crazy is that? It's an extreme example of the identity crisis which we have to deal with as part of all this, which I'll say more about in a minute. But it tends to obscure the larger things that are going on here. So here's how I view this whole deal. Our interdependence simply means we can't get a divorce. That what we do and what happens half a world away affects our common future. And how we relate to our planet increasingly affects our common future. The other nutty story that drove me crazy today is that the American House of Representatives just adopted an amendment. I swear I'm not making this up. To the defense appropriation bill forbidding the Department of Defense from considering climate change in its national security plans, saying they were protecting the military from having President Obama's climate change ideas shoved down their throat. When in fact, the military, even before Barack Obama was elected president, said that climate change presented a national security threat to the United States. I said, but you got to cut through all that. Because my view is that the world is full of positive and negative forces, and the job of every sensate person on the planet, probably for the next 30 years, is to define the terms of our interdependence and to find some way to do something that advances a positive definition of interdependence. So, the most important political book I've read in the last 3 years was a book written by the double Nobel Prize winning microbiologist E.O. Wilson, who was 87 when he wrote it, is now 90, and is in full command of his faculties. I want to be him when I grow up. The book is called The Social Conquest of Earth. Wilson uses all available sources to trace the history of life on the planet from the emergence of single-cell organisms out of the primordial slime to the current day. And he concludes, he basically says, I've always been one of these guys warning of the next bad thing happening and how much species destruction there is, but I'm basically optimistic. Because if you look at the history of all life on the planet, there have been 4 species that have defied every chance that was given to destroy them. They have endured: ants, termites, bees, and people. And he said the only thing they have in common is that of all species that have ever existed on planet Earth, these are the greatest cooperators. There's a fascinating story in the press last week about out of the 43,000 species of spiders on the planet, 25 have evolved to become cooperators instead of loners, and how much more impactful they are. In other words, stay out of their nets, they're much bigger. But anyway, and Wilson tells us about species of ants in rainforests that sense when predators are about to take them over, and some of the ants will go up on the tallest blade of grass and sacrifice themselves so that everybody else can get away. About species of termites in hot climates who dig underground homes and drill 5 holes, but will only go in and out of one. The other 4 are just for air conditioning. And how they won't go in at all when it's about to rain. They sense it. And we all know about the myriad cooperative patterns of bees, which are threatened now by changing agricultural and other patterns. So there has been a decline in the bee population, but I think they will adapt and survive. He says in this book that people are the greatest of all cooperators because, unlike ants, termites, and bees, we have consciousness and a conscience. We see the ramifications of what we do beyond our narrow existence, and we can imagine living differently. And he says, here I am approaching 90. He is 90 now, but he was 87 when he wrote the book. He said, I really am going to leave the earth basically optimistic about what will happen because of our penchant for cooperation. But he said that when we're under stress, we recoil from it and we want to hang with our own kind. And the truth is that we all have to keep expanding the network of people who are in our community, expanding our definition of who is us and shrinking the definition of who is them. And if you look at what's happened in the world, I'll say a little more about this in a moment, there's been a tendency in the aftermath of all this economic distress to see increasing political conflict and an increasing desire to withdraw from interaction with others. Now, having said that, here's where I think we are with this inclusive capitalism issue, because I think it is absolutely fundamental to building the world that we want to leave to our children and grandchildren. Not just because it's good at alleviating poverty, but because the most important thing for people everywhere is to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. People can endure every kind of privation as long as they believe they have the power to make tomorrow different from today in a better way. So if you look at where we are, look at all the good things that are going on. Larry Summers mentioned some of them today. Bill Gates did in his last annual letter. Extreme poverty is way down in the world in the last 25 years. Healthcare indicators are up. Indeed, of all the Millennium Development Goals, we are coming closest to meeting the healthcare goals. And it's a source of great satisfaction to everybody who's been involved in it. And I must say, since we're here, I think the British development program has played a major role in that. And I applaud Prime Minister Cameron for exempting foreign development assistance from the budget knife when he undertook his economic policy. That's good. Technology is promoting empowerment everywhere. Eric Schmidt mentioned today the use of cell phones to undertake banking. I've personally experienced that. When I went to work for the UN in Haiti before the earthquake and then afterward, even before the earthquake, only 15% of the people in Haiti had any interaction with a bank, but 85% of them had cell phones. So a Canadian bank, Scotiabank, and the biggest cell phone company in Haiti, Digicel, owned by an Irishman, combined to offer banking services to the Haitians, and it had a dramatic positive impact on economic activity there. And there are lots of things like that. When I was the UN envoy to the tsunami-affected countries, and we put all the people in Indonesia and Sri Lanka back in their fishing boats, we gave them all cell phones, and their average income increased by 30% because they could finally check what the price of fish was up and down the coast. It was the darndest thing you ever saw, literally. Give a guy a boat, here's your cell phone, nothing else, 30% increase in income. It was amazing. This is a source of encouragement. On a sunny day last week, for the first time since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, Germany generated 74% of its electricity from the sun and the wind. That in a country where the sun shines on average as much as it does in London. You say, well, it was very expensive. Yes, it was. Deutsche Bank says they netted 300,000 jobs out of the transformation. And it's going to get less and less expensive. Furthermore, it's increasingly distributed power. More than half of the clean energy belongs to communities and individuals in the form of windmills and solar panels. I'm encouraged by the rise of women and girls. We know all the exceptions. We hope to God these girls that the Boko Haram took in Nigeria will be released. They really have become the children of the planet. President Obasanjo said today they will find them and release them. He believed. I pray this woman in Sudan won't be killed. I was horrified by what happened to Malala, but it's obscuring the fact that these people are the spear bearers of a movement that is irresistible. And for people who worry about the resources of the planet being used up, the only thing that slows the birth rate without regard to religion, culture, or region in the world is putting all the girls of the world in school and giving all the young women access to the labor market. Wherever women and girls are treated as pieces of property that men have to be able to control, or they don't have any sense of their own manhood, bad things are happening. Wherever women and girls are liberated, good things are happening. So all this is positive. I'm encouraged by the fact that young people have fewer identity hang-ups than their parents and grandparents. I flew here from Sweden. Before that, I was in Abu Dhabi for the first graduating class to the New York University campus there. And I'll tell you just two things. Again, one supporting what Eric Schmidt said earlier about the use of information technology in education. There were 140 graduates. 31 of them came from income so limited that the university paid for one of their family members to be there at the commencement. One of them, who won a Rhodes Scholarship, homeschooled himself in a tiny African village. Himself. Other story. One of our Clinton Global Initiative partners is the HULT network of business schools. And every year, their contribution to the initiative is to give $1 million prize, which goes to either one or two or three, they never more than three, student teams that from universities all over the world that can apply. And they offer their ideas about how to solve a rather intractable social problem. So 2 years ago, the winning team, to answer the question, how can we deploy 20 million photovoltaic cells in African villages and do it in 2 years? How would you do that? Was the team from NYU Abu Dhabi. That's the most important thing is the team members were from India and Pakistan, China, and Taiwan. So all these kids schlep up on the stage, we're about to take a picture. And I looked at them and I said, "Are you absolutely sure that you want this photograph in your local newspaper?" And they said the equivalent of, "We are so over that. We could care less." That should make you feel good. It should make you feel that we can build a common future. I'm encouraged that 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies are projected to be in Africa. I'm encouraged by the fact that the 2 most unequal countries in Latin America, historically Brazil and Mexico, actually had a decline in income inequality in the last decade. They did it in different ways. Brazil with the Bolsa Familia program and creating a whole lot of new jobs while reducing rainforest destruction 75% per year. Mexico by creating a network of 140 tuition-free universities so that in 2010 and 11, for the first time in my lifetime, we had no net in-migration from Mexico in the United States. And Mexico is about a little more than a third of America's population. Last year, they graduated 113,000 engineers. We graduated 120,000. That's encouraging to me, and it should be to you. I'm encouraged that India has elected a government which attracted the presence at the inauguration of the Prime Minister of Pakistan, indicating that the Hindu Nationalist Party may not be an anti-Muslim party. And that a man who was chief minister of his state, who proved he could grow the economy, may finally solve the Gordian knot of Indian economic policy. He may be able to aggregate and deploy capital in a concentrated way that will enable the growth of that country to spread beyond the 35% of the people in the prosperity centers to 100% of the people in India? If so, China will have a worthy competitor for economic growth in the 21st century. I'm encouraged by all the basic domestic policies announced by the new president of China. Just like I'm worried about the foreign conflicts, if China had not abandoned its one-child policy, within 20 years, the workforce in the United States would have been younger. I'm encouraged by the agreement that the President of China made with President Obama to try to do something about hydrofluorocarbons, which basically are greenhouse gases that are more powerful than carbon dioxide, produced almost exclusively by room air conditioners. The people of China and India and other hot places need and deserve room air conditioners, but they can be produced so that they don't emit HFCs. And it can make a real difference. It'll create new businesses. It'll be a net economic benefit if the capital financing can be arranged. But there are 4 big problems that are barriers directly and indirectly to more inclusive capitalism. First is the simple fact is that there is excessive inequality in incomes and access to capital to form new businesses, access to education, and access to sufficient political capacity to influence the course of events in many places. You don't have to have a voting democracy, but you do have to have a say. There has to be some way that people can have a say. I noticed a couple of people around me winced when in the morning panel, the young participant from China said, "Oh, the inequality is not so bad. You got to have it. We're for it. And besides that, it takes time to get over." The truth is, everybody here favors a certain amount of inequality. How'd we get in these chairs today anyway? Every market rewards people who are good at things. That's not the issue. The issue is, as we have learned over and over again, all markets tend to excess. And if you have too much inequality, it is a severe constraint on growth itself. The second problem we have is instability. Everybody here favors a certain amount of instability. You can't have a market without instability. If there could be no losers, there would be no winners. You would have a static system. But if there is too much instability, and this is what happened in the aftermath of this, and as nearly as I can determine every previous financial crisis, it's a severe constraint on growth because people just shut down. So the question with the first 2 challenges is, how do you have enough inequality and instability to have a vibrant capitalist system without having so much that it's a constraint on growth and may even shut down investment? And I think these are legitimate questions that really have to be faced. I asked Andrew Liveris before I opened what happened in the panel where he was, and I didn't get to attend. But at the heart of all this, at least in the developed countries, is what is the role of investors in the corporate culture? And how has that changed over time? When I was in law school 40 years ago, corporate law and practice were taught pretty much the way they had been since the 1930s. That is, corporations in the West, at least, were creatures of the state. They were given certain legal protections like limited liability, in return for which they were supposed to respond to the needs of 4 constituencies: their customers, their shareholders, their employees, and the communities of which they were a part. Then we had the globalization of finance even before we had the globalization of business. And over time, finance and the people responding to them, principally the people running corporations, tended to take primacy over what happened to the employees and the communities and even the customers. And it has become a serious problem. So that companies that aren't part of it are actually considered remarkable exceptions now. Wages are the lowest percentage of corporate revenues in the United States they have been in more than 50 years. And you could say, well, that's just because of productivity. There are probably fewer people to pay. I corrected for that before I said this. So it's too much. And I have here a letter I just got. Somebody handed me that Larry Fink, the chairman of BlackRock, sent to chairman and CEO of companies he worked with, saying, among other things, that he believed companies that BlackRock invest in should be primarily focused on achieving sustainable returns over the long run. It was a long-term strategy for growth was the most important thing in corporate governance. We ought to give him an attaboy and say, we have to have more people who think that way. And I think it is very, very important. Let me say there are conservative and liberal ways to achieve more inclusive capitalism that reduce inequality and instability. I'll give you an example. And I realize you're entitled to say I was president in the dark ages, because the day I became president in 1993, the average cell phone weighed 5 pounds. And there were only 50 sites on the internet. So I'm prepared to accept that. But when I was a governor, I recruited to my home state a steel company that revolutionized mini mill production called Nucor. The founder of Nucor was a conservative Republican. I'd be surprised if he ever voted for me, but we were friends and I thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. When I was president, Nucor became the third biggest steel company in America. They had thousands of employees. They paid a wage that was only 65 to 75% of the industry average. But they paid weekly production bonuses. So that every 2 weeks when people got their paycheck, their average income was varied between 130 and 200% of the industry average. Meanwhile, he, the founder of this burgeoning company, had no corporate headquarters. They rented office space in an office park in Charlotte, North Carolina, only 22,000 feet or 12,000 feet. They only had 22 people in the central office. When they had 11 steel mills in America, they only had 4 layers of management. Every employee got a benefit unlimited to the number of kids you have, then of $1,500 a child for every child you had in college. And when by the 90s it was up to $2,300, and today it's over $3,000. And there's also a benefit for college education for spouses. And if you want to go yourself at night, they give you a subsidy, and it doesn't count against anything else you get. The company's profit sharing plan was on top of that and didn't include the top management. And they had a strict no layoff policy. In the only year when I was working with them, where they made less money than they did the year before, even though they still were profitable, Ken Iverson sent the following letter to all of his employees. He said, as you know, we have a strict no layoff policy in this company. And we're not making as much money as we did last year, even though we're still profitable. So you will lose 20 to 25% of your income. He said, I'm very sorry for that, but it's not your fault. You did everything I asked you to do. It is our fault. He said, I should have been smart enough to figure out how we could be the only steel company in the entire world that escaped the downturn in the steel business. So your income's going down 20%. I'm reducing mine 60%. He was already only making $450,000 a year, and there was a big article I remember about how he became the lowest paid executive of all the Fortune 500 companies, and he wore it like a badge of honor because his passion was to recognize that the people who worked there were the people who produced the steel and made all the money for the company. They also had bonus programs for the non-production employees and lots of other things. But the point is, this guy was in the steel business. He wasn't in the, I gotta be rich and important business. Nobody had a company car. Nobody had a fixed parking place at any of the plants or at the headquarters. He lived to make the enterprise work, and he thought that the people were the core of it. We got to get some of that back. When you see people going to work, I could stand on the street in New York and look at 3 office buildings and watch people go in and tell you, after watching them for an hour, which companies are doing the best, without even knowing. You look at it, you see the spring in the step of the employees when they're going in, or are they just one more day at the office? We can overcomplicate this. This is a very big deal. I'll give you another example of a conservative way to deal with these challenges. The first carbon tax, as nearly as I can determine, in the world was adopted by a conservative government in Sweden in 1991. And they said, we don't want to build up government. We don't think the government can fix this problem. We just want people to know the burden that their carbon use is imposing on our economy and on our environment. So they priced carbon, and they taxed people, and they turned right around and gave them the money back with an explanation of what the tax was and said, now look, if you want to spend this money exactly as you did last year, have at it, but it would be a really stupid thing to do. What you should do is use this cash to become more efficient. Okay, that was 91. By late 97, when we got the Kyoto Accord, Sweden's economy had grown 50% while reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by 7%. So much that when other countries got their quotas about how much they'd have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels, Sweden got a 4% increase quota. My point is, if you're a conservative and you don't like the government, there's still ways to figure out how to advance our common interest, and it's a much better strategy than denial. There are also progressive ways to do it. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett pooling their fortunes and investing it in a way that I can tell you personally, because I do a lot of partnership work with the Gates Foundation, have saved more lives than I can account for in this moment. The healthcare systems of Europe and Japan that produced high returns at relatively low costs as compared with the United States. Whenever people tell me how terrible this new healthcare law is, I said the only thing more terrible was staying at the status quo, where we were spending 17.8% of GDP on healthcare, and no European country was over 12, and no big European country was over 11.8. That's $1 trillion a year we were spending to get worse health outcomes. And again, there are conservative and liberal ways. Wim Kok, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, is here. The Dutch spend 12% of GDP on health care, and they have no government health care directly. There's an individual mandate, everybody buys a policy, and if your income's below a certain amount, you get subsidized. If you have no income, you get the whole price subsidized. And I talked to the head of a big insurance company who's a partner of ours at CGI, Oxy, a lot of you probably know it. And I was over there for their 200th anniversary, and I said, "You write health insurance?" And he said, "Yeah, we all do." But he said, "We don't make any money on it. I just try to recover our administrative costs." And I said, "Does it bother you?" He said, "No." He said, "Healthcare is a public good. It really shouldn't be financed by private insurance, but you got to figure out some way to finance it. And it's wrong to make a profit on it." And he said, "If I can't make profit for this company in the old-fashioned way by doing insurance business, I have no business. They should fire me tomorrow." Now, I couldn't imagine anybody in America saying such a thing, which is probably why they covered everybody and we didn't, and we spent more and got worse results. The only thing I'm saying is this is not necessarily a left-right argument. It's an argument for more inclusive capitalism. That $1 trillion, if we had had that $1 trillion every year in the 1990s, we could have hired more people, raised more wages, invested more in research and development, grown the private sector more. This is a big deal. When I asked Andrew about talking about his activist investor and the difference in patient capital and activist investor, this guy wants him to sell one of the most profitable divisions of his company because it takes 5 whole years to build a chemical plant. It's already profitable. It's about to double in profits. The guy wants to force him to dump this so he can make money in less than a year, claim his capital gains, get out of Dodge, and go find something else to gamble on. It's crazy. It takes 5 years to build a chemical plant. Dow Chemical's important to America. They actually are bringing manufacturing jobs back. That's another thing, by the way, I'll make you a prediction. It'll be a good news story. Even though manufacturing is the most productive sector of the economy, it's chased low-cost labor. Because it's the most productive, every year that passes, labor's a lower percentage of the cost, and materials, energy, and transport are a higher percentage. Therefore, I predict to you that all over the world you'll see more and more countries become more self-sufficient in manufacturing, not because of protectionism, but because there'll be distributed manufacturing the way there is distributed green power, the way there is distributed telecommunications. But we have to think about this. If you want inclusive capitalism, at least you have to seize the opportunities that are there and not favor speculators over investors. And so that's my take on it. And the fourth thing I want to say that is sort of beyond the scope of this conference, but we have to recognize it, is that all this uncertainty and all this anxiety and the sense of the game being rigged against you has led to real identity problems in the modern world. We need practical solutions, but a culture of inclusion and a consciousness of inclusion. If you're an American, I spent $3 billion of your money, your tax money, to sequence the human genome in a multinational effort. And if you're American, you should know that we have now gotten $180 billion in private sector investment out of it since 2000. And it's just the beginning. It's going to be the best money we ever spent. But what the genome showed is that we're all 99.5% the same. I mean, it's an amazingly diverse crowd. If every non-age-related difference you can see in this audience is rooted in 0.5% of your genome, including the gender differences. And yet we all spend 99.5% of our time thinking about the 0.5% of us that's different. Don't we? And I'm not just talking about economics or politics. Personally, we do. We're wired and have been since we emerged from the African savanna 150 to 200,000 years ago to preserve ourselves and our families and then our kind And so all of human history has been this tension between widening the circle of who is us and shrinking the one of who is them. And we do have genuine conflicts. But we have to create a predisposition anyway for non-zero sum games so that all the participants can win. And that's what I tried to do in the 90s. I tried to create the WTO and bring China into it. Expand the Asia-Pacific Leaders Meeting. Create a Summit of the Americas and commit to a free trade area of the Americas. Expand NATO, but with a special agreement. All these people, by the way, that blame me for Ukraine because I humiliated Russia by expanding NATO, find me one Pole who agrees with them today. But we didn't just do that. We made a deal with Russia and with Ukraine, and I told them I'd get them in if they wanted. I also signed an agreement with the president of Russia and the president of Ukraine that if Ukraine gave its nuclear weapons back to Russia, Russia would always accept its territorial integrity. Something that's sort of been lost in the mist in this last period. But my point is, I kept trying to build these networks so that people would be secure in their own identity and feel part of a larger one. So now, you know, in the UK, you're having probably the most benign example of this I can think of, the Scottish referendum, although I strongly favor your hanging in there together. But you have all these people got elected to the EU Parliament. I don't know what it means. You had a low voter turnout and they don't have any power, so it may be just a way to vent steam. But you shouldn't be surprised. When people feel insecure and under duress, we all want to hang with our own kind. It is a deeply psychological response that is ingrained over millennia in all of us. And another reason you should want more inclusive capitalism, because it'll give people more collective security to do what is right anyway. And we have to continue to work on that. So finally, let me just make this point. The private sector's job, it seems to me, is to do what you do best, but to look for ways to do it in a way that expands the circle of opportunity and recognizes that there's often more than one way to make a profit, and one way will do much better than others in promoting inclusive capitalism. I'll give you an example in a minute on that. The government's job is empowering people so that they can make the most of these opportunities through education, training, decent public health, all the things that you know, to help those who through no fault of their own can't help themselves, and to provide a security environment. And even in well-developed societies that acquire huge liabilities for retirees or for healthcare costs, we have to control for the need to have a significant amount of investment in the future, because there will always be some R&D, some new avenues that the private sector will not be able to profitably pursue until certain developments occur. That's what we did with the $3 billion for the genome. And this does not require a bigger government. I do think that government management needs a lot of thought. It's not just corruption that's a problem in this world, it's capacity. And I was really proud of the fact that when I left office, the government was the smallest it's been since Dwight Eisenhower was president. But it was easier for me than Eisenhower, because all I did was basically bring IT in every aspect of our government. But Inc. magazine, sort of the house organ of small business entrepreneurs when I was president, gave the Social Security Administration its annual award as the best consumer response organization in America, not a private company. They said we did the best job. And all we did was put all the stuff on the internet and let people deal with us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Stuff you take for granted today, but then it was new. The other thing I want to say is it is government's job to pursue policies that give incentives to the private sector and use tax revenues in a way that reduce poverty. Because the private sector alone will never be able in advanced economies to just go after poor people. For example, when we passed welfare reform, we had 20,000 private companies join an alliance with us to hire people from welfare to work, but we gave them special incentives to do so, and they hired 1 million people. And when we had the mini recession because the dot-com bubble burst in 2001, those 1 million people were actually slightly less likely than the workforce as a whole to be laid off because they were so grateful for their jobs. That's the sort of stuff government should do. And this is the chart I'm proudest of. You can probably, the gray is me, the yellow is President Reagan. And it shows how much each quintile of the American economy increased. Reagan had a good run because we'd never run big deficits before in normal economic times. And so we went on an 8-year sugar high and created a whole lot of jobs, mostly in defense. But the bottom 20% only increased its income 0.7%. In the top 20%, 22.7%. I didn't quite do as well with the top 20%. They only increased their income 20.4%. But the bottom 20% increased their income 23.6%. And 100 times, 100 times as many people moved out of poverty. That's government's job, to make the economy work, to be business friendly, but to do it in a way that favors moving people out of poverty. The final point I want to make is this. One of the great good news stories of the 21st century so far is the explosion of NGOs, even though it can be a pain in the rear. That is, everybody wanted to go to Haiti and help, and when I was down there working with them, trying to get everybody to sign on and agree to the common economic plan and reconcile their efforts was a real challenge. We did a good job of it in the Asian tsunami. There was an extraordinary amount of coordination among the NGOs. But in Haiti, they'd been there for decades, and a lot of them, it was more difficult. But the basic job of the NGO in the modern world, I believe, besides its traditional work of filling the gaps between what the private sector can produce and the government can provide, is to figure out how to do things faster, cheaper, better in partnership with the private sector and the government. So I think you should all look for ways to either support such NGOs or to be a part of them. And if you'll let me, I'll just give you in closing a couple of examples. When Nelson Mandela and I were both out of office, we had 10 good years working together. And the first couple of years were before the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and Malaria and President Bush's PEPFAR program were created. So there's basically no money for AIDS. So we went around rattling a tin cup trying to find countries who would give us money. And I got a commitment first from Canada and Ireland to allocate up to $20 million US a year for 5 years, and I asked them to give me no money. I said, I want you to give it to the countries involved so we can build the capacity of government once I get a no corruption pledge. But we had the money. So we went to the major manufacturers of pediatric AIDS drugs and regular AIDS drugs, who were then, the generic manufacturers were mostly in China, though there was one big one in South Africa, mostly in India, but the ingredients came from China. It was interesting. Ingredients from China were taken by Indian manufacturers to make generic AIDS drugs. At the time, the drugs were $500 a person a year, far cheaper than the $10,000 we were paying in America. but a lot of money for a country with incomes of under $1 a day. So here's what happened. I went to them and I said, this is a low volume, high profit margin, uncertain payment business with a lousy supply chain. I want you to go to a massive volume, very low profit margin, prompt and certain payments with a better supply chain that will help you develop. And I gave them my word. I said, if you don't make more money doing it this way, I'll tear up the contract. Keep in mind, they were private sector companies. You can't get anywhere asking anybody to lose money in the private sector. I just asked them to make money in a different way. The price dropped from $500 to $190 to $160 to $140 to $120, eventually to $90. The price of the children's drugs dropped from $600 to $60. They made more money. And as a result today of the more or less 10.5 million people or so on AIDS medicine, almost 6 million get them off contracts we negotiated. 75% of all the kids staying alive get them off these contracts. And the good news is it's not morally or practically feasible to give our foundation that kind of discount, so it collapsed the entire price structure of the market. They're all making more money, and everybody can buy the drugs within 10% of my price. That's the kind of thing we can do to make things more inclusive. Believe me, it freed up lots of money in these countries. It made healthcare better. It made inclusive capitalism more possible. Then we did the same thing in America with soft drinks. When we started on childhood obesity, there were poor children in America getting 50 to 60% of their daily calories just from the drinks they were getting in school. So we got all the soft drink companies together and the juice companies together, and I said, I know you're not trying to give these kids diabetes. I know you're not trying to kill them. I really don't. And they weren't. I mean, they were good people. They were just doing what they'd always done. And I said, I want you to get together and figure out how to get these sugar drinks out of the schools and how to lower the portion size of the juice, because that has a lot of sugar. And we did 4 or 5 other things. Point is, there was no government regulation. There was no tax. They did it entirely with an agreement. They did it. We just worked with them and told them what we do with the AIDS drugs. And in more than 90% of the schools, there's been a 90% reduction in the total calories being shipped to our kids in drinks in schools. 90%, total agreement. That's a more inclusive capitalism too. We did the same thing with farm inputs in Africa. Our anchor farm in Malawi serves 20,000 farmers. We lowered the cost of feed, fertilizer, and seed. We took the crops to market. We stored them properly. The productivity of the land increased 2.5-fold. In 1 year, these 20,000 farmers were making less than $1 a day. In 1 year, their average income increase was 570%. 1 year. We're talking women with a hoe farming an acre. This is very important. China and Saudi Arabia and several other countries have lots of money and can't feed themselves. The preferred option, if you've got a lot of money and you can't feed yourself, is go lease some land or buy it somewhere, mechanize the land, take the food and run. The problem is you'll ruin the topsoil that way, and it will be extremely destructive of the socioeconomic systems of a lot of these African countries. So I'm trying to prove that these small farmers can feed these countries and export food and become part of the global food chain that will alleviate the problems they have. I can't take this to scale, but I think by the time we get to 100,000 farmers in about 2 years, we'll get the same results, and we may be able to get enough capital there to change the model. The point is, the NGO did, all we did was do something faster, cheaper, better. The private sector did it, and they're making money. Everybody's making more money, including the people that are selling the fertilizer and the seed at lower cost because of the volume. There are lots of ways to do this. So my final point is this. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Don't be deterred by what you don't know. You believe in markets, you've proved they've worked, you're all very successful. You earned your success. You're worried about the future or you wouldn't be here. Do something. Do something. You know, it's amazing. I keep telling everybody, we all like to give poetic, philosophical musings on the nature of the modern world. It's more important to look at this as a job. This is a job. It's our collective job. We are defining the terms of our interdependence. And there's somebody just like you in some poor village in Africa or Latin America or Asia whose whole life could be devastated if the ice cap on Greenland melts and all the ice breaks off for the South Pole. Or if we never figure out how to create enough jobs for all those kids that were in Tahrir Square that started the Arab Spring. One of the reasons they were there is the Egyptian University Network, God bless them, continued to produce 400,000 university graduates a year, and the Egyptian economy had nowhere near 400,000 jobs for them. They're out there, and they're just like you. And we cannot let the world be defined by the negative things I talked about. E.O. Wilson was right. Everywhere in the world, people are in creative networks of cooperation, good things are happening. Everywhere in the world, conflict dominates, good things are not happening. We know what got you into these chairs today. Our simple job is to give more people the opportunity to sit in them. Thank you very much.